Today, I'd like to talk to you about some of the techniques I find the most useful when I'm starting to learn a new piece of music. And you might be surprised I'm not just going to say to do it slowly and hands separately. So hopefully this video will give you some ideas that you might not have thought of before. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. Now, I'm not going to say that I don't practice slowly or hands separately, of course I do. However, I find that these techniques, whilst they're extremely useful when we're trying to do things like work out our fingering scheme, while we're first looking at the notes, we're trying to work out the harmonies, we're doing a little bit of memorization, whatever, their usefulness is sort of overstated when it comes to being able to fix problems and find solutions to things that we're not able to do very easily. Let me start off by saying, though, that the most effective practice technique will always really depend on the actual piece of music that we're trying to learn. However, there is one that I find works in pretty much every circumstance, and that's the idea of sections. And I actually took this idea to a different level by introducing the notion of a nested hierarchy of sections. So let's start with the building blocks idea. Now, if you'll let me digress for a second, when I started recording these YouTube videos, I did quite a lot of research into filmmaking, would you believe, to see what I thought I'd need to understand to be able to film myself. A concept I discovered is that of scenes, sequences and shots. And if you watch anything from a cooking program on the TV to a blockbuster movie, they're all put together using this same basic formula. Now let's go back to music and how we can break this down into its building blocks. So as films are broken down into scenes, sequences and shots, I think we can break music down in a similar way. However, vocabulary-wise, I think the words sections, segments and snippets probably work better. When we first look to break down a piece, our sections will be our highest level building block. So let's take a well-known example, Debussy's Clair de Lune. To me, this logically breaks down into four main sections: measures 1 to 14, measures 15 to 26, measures 27 to 50, and then measures 51 to 72. Now we've decided on our sections, we're ready to further subdivide into segments. Let's deep dive into the second section, so measures 15 to 26. Within this, perhaps we could define three different segments. So we've got bars 16 to 18, bars 90 to 24, and then bar 25 and 26. Next then, our final step is to break each of these down into snippets. Again, there's no right or wrong way to do this. I'd probably opt for 2 measures each as a snippet, as it seems to make sense for the way the music is made and the patterns that you've got. However, there are 2 major things to think about when we do decide on our snippets. The first, I think, is that each one of them should lend itself to being practiced in specific ways. And I got this idea from the quarto edition of the Chopin Etudes, where he in fact creates tiny practice exercises based specifically on different small parts of the etudes. Now, he doesn't use the term snippets, but it's a very similar idea. In fact, as you can see, this is a great combination of both a practice technique and also of a way of organising our practice time effectively. So when it comes to the idea of practicing itself, fingers on keys, I find that there are 2 main ways we seek to do it. The first and most frequent is that we try to simplify something. Hands separately, slowly, those are the most obvious ways of simplifying something. But we also sometimes, maybe in 20% of cases, might seek to actually make something slightly more complicated. So maybe practicing something 20% faster than we would ever want to perform it. But I'm sure you'd agree that as a general rule, when we start in learning something new, we'll seek to make it easier to practice rather than more difficult. And the 3 ways I find it most effective to make something easier is to either remove some of the notes, it's to mess about with the time signature, or it's to use a technique I call add-on. Now, these aren't the only things I do, but they're always a very good starting point for anything that I'm going to find a little bit tricky to learn. So let's start with this idea of removing some of the notes. I'll give you here some examples of how I've used these in the past. Now for me, there are two principal things with this piece that are a little tricky. The first is the rhythm, which is sort of very cleverly syncopated, and it's marked by the right hand octaves. And if you look very carefully, you'll see that sometimes these octaves fall at the same time as the left hand, and sometimes they don't. So trying to get this rhythm nice and settled in our minds is really important. And then the second thing that's tricky with it is the fact that we've got the left hand jumping around, and it's going from an octave to a chord and then of course back again. Now, whilst it's probably possible to start practicing this as written, especially if we slow it down enough, the good thing that I found was to actually simplify it so that we can focus more on just the rhythm and the left hand to start with. And a handy way to do this is if we take all of the single notes that are in the right hand and we simply omit them and only play the octaves, then of course, first we just have a set of E-flat octaves in the right hand, so we're not jumping about anywhere, and of course then we've got a lot less notes to think about. And then when we put just these octaves with the left hand, the rhythm isn't reinforced in our minds for us. However, we can even take this a step further by simplifying the left hand. And a useful way that I found to practice jumps, in fact it came from Graham Fitch, is to actually, if you're jumping to a chord, rather than try to land on all the notes, only land on some of them. So in this case, it's always a triad that we've got in the left hand, so we can practice just landing on 2 of the 3 notes. This means that first we can omit the top note, then we can omit the bottom note, and then finally we can omit the middle note. This of course then means that we're able to start off practicing hands together without needing to worry about being daunted by what we need to do. And the reason I do this, and I've talked about it before, was that I read in Neuhaus' book, The Art of Piano Playing, that in actual fact we should really think of hand-separate practice as an emergency exit, so not our first starting point, but only something we use in an emergency situation where we can't do anything else. When I first started practicing it, I did what I always do with any piece, and that's really to focus on bringing out the melody line to make sure that that sings above the rest. However, given that this is Bach, who is of course famous for counterpoint and multi-voices, and also because this was a piece originally written for a string quintet, I thought actually I should probably focus more on the other voices as well. For me then, the most significant challenge really was trying to distinguish between the second violin and the viola parts. When I was first trying to fix this problem, I basically used Graham Fitch's advice of practicing strands separately. He did a video for Pianist magazine where he was talking about hand-separate practice, and he also mentioned strand-separate practice here. And effectively what he's saying is that you practice one or more voices together or individually rather than the entire piece. So for example, you might try to practice just the cello and viola together, omitting the bass, the first and second violins. The strand-separate technique does make a very interesting and valuable way of practicing. I found that to get the maximum benefit, it was easier just to focus on small 2-bar segments and play each of these using a variety of the different voices. So say just double bass and first violin, cello and viola, cello and second violin, bass and second violin, etc. found this to be incredible mental gymnastics, for me at least anyway, as of course you need to make sure you maintain the same fingering that you intend to use when you put all of the voices back together. Now we can work on the next snippet of this segment. A good way to approach this, I found, was to actually simplify it at first by removing the left hand jump. So we play the right hand as written, but just the left hand octaves. Pay real close attention to the fact that the left hand is basically a descending scale here. The right hand also follows a pattern of single notes followed by a 2-note chord. Practice like this until you feel really confident with it. Try playing from the beginning of the segment to the end of the snippet by using the simplified version here. Now we're ready to add in those left hand jumps. As you can see, there are a variety of different ways we can implement this strategy. And in fact, the same goes for our next idea, which is that of rhythmic variations or time signature variations. So again, here are some ways that I've been able to use that on pieces I've learned recently. One piece of advice that I came across from a few respectable teachers was to actually play small sections at normal tempo and then take a break between the sections. So effectively you give your brain time to catch up after it's played one flurry of notes before it needs to focus on the next set. Anyway, one day it occurred to me whilst I was sitting at the piano that if I just added one extra beat per bar, so rather than having 3/4, I had 4/4 for each as my time signature, then I'd effectively be building into the music the break that these teachers were talking about, and that would perhaps give my brain time to catch up. So I decided to put this into practice, and that's where the 4/4 idea came from. One way to do this is to do it using this pattern. As you can see, this is a minim crotchet pattern that gives you the 4 beats in the bar. Another alternative is then to do it like this. Now this pattern is a crotchet, minim, crotchet, again giving you 4 beats in the bar. And then of course you take that to the third variation, which is to use crotchet, crotchet, minim, which would sound something like this. So I've found that this technique has helped me tremendously for 3 reasons really. First, having that extra beat per bar, having that little break, does really give your brain time to catch up from one set of notes between the next. And that's really, really helpful. I think also the second reason is that whilst effective you are in a way playing it slower because it's taking more time to play the piece, the notes that you are playing are pretty much all at the tempo that you finally want to get to. So you're actually practicing, faster, quicker. And then I think the third and final reason is because, as I showed you, you're putting in the extra beat at a different point in each time and effectively creating 3 different practice patterns. You are practicing a different set of notes at speed each time without a break. So it's closer to the real performance situation. A helpful way to practice the initial I found is to actually imagine that this is in groups of 4 eighth notes rather than groups of 3. I call this the modified time signature later on. By that I mean we convert the first eighth note of each set into a quarter note, so we have much more time to think about the jump. So instead of counting 1, 2, 3, we count 1, 2, 3, 4. Once we can easily manage like this, then we can start practicing as written. Now, something I found is always a very good starting point is dotted rhythms. And this is basically because we're then practicing 2 notes quickly at any one point in time. And of course, we've got 2 different versions of a dotted rhythm. We can have a dot on the first note of every pair, or we can have a dot on the second note of every pair. This basically means that we're constantly alternating between fast and slow notes. And of course, if we use both variants, then we're actually playing all of the notes quickly, but just not at the same time. Now, I find that the dotted rhythm is helpful just to get us used to the fingering, just to get us used to the notes. But after that, I'd put it to one side and I'd move on to different variants that are basically based on the design of the music. And what I do is think about the left hand and how we can split things down based on that. As a first variant, we can pause on, say, the first and the third left-hand eighth note of each. And we then have for the first snippet a run of 5 fast notes, followed by a run of 4, and finally a run of 3. Now, if you find it helpful to annotate this on your score when you're first practicing it, a very useful way of doing it is to use a caesura. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Basically, it's the marking that means take a break and then start again. So for our first snippet, we can notate it like this. This then means we'll play fast until the first A natural, then we'll pause, then we'll continue fast until the E natural, then we'll pause and then we'll play the rest. Our second snippet then would look something like this. Now, there's no real need to worry about how long each break is. The key is we're working on getting the fast notes even, controlled and comfortable. Then another variant we can use is to move that fermata to be at the end of the second and the fourth of each group of eighth notes. So our first snippet then would look something like this. And our second would look something like this. What you'll probably have noticed is that when we do it this way, we're practicing slightly different groups of notes fast each time, rather than always the same group of notes fast, in a gradual, progressive manner. And the best way I find to do this is to first practice groups of 2 snippets, before practicing groups of 3, and then before practicing groups of 4. So if we were to break it down into groups of 2 snippets, it would start to look something like this. As you can see, this gives us 5 distinct groups to practice. When we do it in groups of 3 snippets, it looks like this. This then gives us 4 distinct groups to work on. Finally, when we do it in groups of 4, we have 3 distinct groups. Now, this is all well and good, but I have found that sometimes making that jump can be just a little bit difficult to do. So we can again use our practice variants to help us out here. So first, when we start to join groups of snippets together, let's use our same caesura markings. So now we've gone from the original 12 notes right up to 20. However, for now, we're still only actually playing 4 notes at a time at full speed. And we also have the variant where we have the caesura after the second of each group of 2 eighth notes in the left hand. And that looks like this. And then finally, we've got the idea of moving the caesura to after each group of 4 16th notes in the right hand, which looks like this. Our next step then is to start removing some of these caesura as we're practicing. So our first step might be to just have one between each snippet. However, we can also do this by selectively removing others as well. Now, one of the tricks to this technique I've found is that it pays to use either as few or as many different variants as we need to be able to get more and more notes put together. One thing it's probably worth pointing out is that you can see this strategy lends itself both to keeping a strict tempo, but also to practicing without needing to keep a strict tempo. And that leads on to something that I think is very closely related to this, but I've called it the power pause. In fact, it was sort of inspired by that famous quote from Franz Liszt, where he said we should think 10 times and play once. So let me explain in more detail how I do this. So the idea is that we consciously say, okay, just before I start the part where I've changed my fingering, I'm going to pause, I'm going to think, I'm going to visualize the new fingering, work out where my hands will be moving, and then and only then actually move on and play the notes. And what I found is basically when we do this, it stops the brain from automatically invoking the old procedure and helps it to realize that there's a new procedure that it now needs to use. So now let's think about this then in the context of tricky passages. And by this, I'm talking about, those fiddly little bits that appear in pieces that we otherwise feel we play relatively well. So say the Chopin fioritura that you get in a lot of his works. Now, in cases like this, we will have spent probably lots of time working on the individual little things, in isolation. And in my tutorials on the A-flat waltz and the E-flat nocturne, I give practice tips on how we can work on these fioritura to get them under our fingers. However, I've also then found that when we put them back into the context of the piece, it's easy for them to sort of fall apart. And this is where the power pause can really help. So in a case like this, what I would do is immediately, either before the first note of the tricky piece or on the first note of it, pause, relax, think about the notes that I need to play, think about how I want them to sound, think about the fingering that I'm going to be using, and then take a deep breath and play through the notes that I want to play. And this is something I found that works in lots of places, that little sort of cadenza-esque bit in Consolation No. 3 from Liszt, many other pieces that I've played that have got, a tricky little passage in them. The idea of having the power pause to think through what I need to do rather than going straight on into it has always helped me get much, much more secure with these problems so that effectively they no longer fall apart. So finally then, let's look at add-on. Now this is something we can do at a very detailed level, so within a phrase, but it's also something we can use at a higher level within a piece. So let's look at the detail part of it first. Here, when we come to join these snippets together, we might need to use some additional techniques to help us. And a good one of these is the add-on technique. The tricky bit here is that we finish snippet 1 on finger 5, yet we need to start snippet 2 on the same note, but with a different finger. So we might find it helpful before trying to combine two entire snippets to combine them bit by bit. There we might stop immediately after the first finger change. So we simply play to the line here and then we stop without trying to connect the remainder of the second snippet. And then we can do something similar to the second finger change. I also use this same idea to join snippets 5 and 6 because basically snippet 6 was the most difficult of all of them for me. As a result, there I stopped slightly more often, basically stopped once with each left-hand note. If we still think this is likely to be a challenge, we can use what I call the add-on technique, which is where we start with a small number of notes and we progressively add notes to that. So here we could start up with just the pickup and the first beat of the first measure. Then we can add another one. Then we can add another one. And we keep on doing this basically until we've got the entire snippet done. So when we look at this at a higher level, I've actually taken to calling this integrate as part of my 4-step process. So then, once we've got all of this groundwork done, we're ready to start our integration step. And the first idea is to be able to get each segment that we can play end to end. I'd be inclined to avoid trying to go from one snippet to all of the snippets together. and I'd add them progressively, because I've basically found that the more I need to do, the more likely I am to get tense. So this in fact means that we can do 2 snippets at a time, and then we can do 3 snippets at a time. I also find that it's really helpful to keep removing our hands from the keyboard. So let's say we practice in snippets 2 and 3, and we're going to do 3 iterations of them. So what I would do is I'd do the first iteration, remove my hands from the keyboard, then do the second, remove my hands again, and then do the third. Then once we're happy that we can get both of the segments, independently okay, it's time to start adding them together. And again, don't just jump from going to 2 segments straight away. Use the add-on method. And the way I'd add on is not a note at a time this time, rather I'd add on an entire snippet at a time. So we start with the first segment plus the first snippet of segment 2, then 2 snippets of segment 2, then 3 snippets of segment 2, then 4 snippets of segment 2. And again, do this over a number of days if you like. You don't need to achieve this in one go. We need to make sure we keep remaining nice and relaxed whilst we're doing this. However, and here's the real power tip, we always get better results when we're able to combine these different kinds of strategies together. So for example, we might remove some of the notes and use add-on at the same time. Another way we could do it is that we could remove some of the notes and play with a modified time signature. So these are my favourite techniques. Which are yours? Let me know in the comments. Now, for the best resources on how to learn how to practice, I invite you to watch the video here, which introduces you to the online academy. And if you're not already, then please do subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner. Don't forget to hit the little bell icon so you're notified of new videos as and when they're released. I thank you very much for watching today and look forward to seeing you very soon.